back, relax, and maybe get yourself a snack. Me and you gonna have a little chat about books. Hi guys! So I'm here today to review 3 books for you that are all quite mixed. There's one that's a dystopian, one that's a sci-fi, and one that's a fantasy. So let's get started. The first book I have to talk to you guys about is this one, Too Like the Lightning by Ada Palmer. This one was a struggle for me, guys. It really was. I adore the cover of this. I've heard great things from friends of mine about this book and it sounded really promising, but with that said, I also heard from a couple of people that it was very confusing and that it was weird and it was going to take time to get into. So I went into this book kind of knowing that about it, and I knew a lot of the friends who had told me it was brilliant were friends who like to read kind of quite intense science fiction books that are really thought-provoking and weird and odd, and I'm not really that kind of sci-fi reader. I tend to enjoy more spoon-fed science fiction. I like it to be easy, I like it to just be a fun romp. I like sort of space opera sci-fi more than anything, probably. But I do like to challenge myself as well. So when I heard about this, I thought, right, I'm going to give it a try. It was nominated for the Hugos. I want to give it at least a fair shot and read it all. And I did that. But even though I think this book has some fantastic ideas, particularly when it comes to gender, because it does play with that theme very strongly, and particularly when it comes to imagination, because there's a whole different setup to this world that is very unique, very different from our world. It's largely focused on sort of political groups, and countries have kind of faded into obscurity. We don't really have them anymore. It's a lot more about who you support and where you are in the world. Doesn't really matter as much. It's more about who you support and who you are influenced by. There's a lot of really interesting characters in this. We actually follow a main character who is a criminal, which is an interesting element in itself. But one of the things that I found quite jarring about this was that even though this is set in our far future, it's in a world that is very much developed from ours, but is quite weird now. It didn't feel like it was that futuristic. It felt a little bit deluded, maybe. I just didn't feel like it was genuine enough for me to really believe it, which is fine because it's science fiction, it's made up anyway. But then when you add in our main character kind of speaking in 17th century English rather than modern day our English, that was weird to me. I didn't feel like that made sense, and it kind of irritated me to a point that it was too much. So there's different moments in this book where we're just following along the story and it's in normal English, and then there's other moments where our main character breaks away from the story and talks to us directly, the reader. And this is all in sort of 17th century, very weird English that just didn't really gel with me at all. It just made me annoyed. So that was a problem. Then I had the issue of it's got so much potential. This world is filled with potential, and yet because it's a debut possibly, I just didn't feel like we ever got there. We didn't ever feel like anything went anywhere. I felt like it was on this meaningless, sort of meandering, weird quest to find this thing out about a list. It just never really went anywhere. It just didn't feel like it ever really got to the point. And I feel like some of the ideas that I did like, for example, there's a character called Bridger who can animate inanimate objects. So if he had like a toy soldier, he'd be able to animate it into a real person who was a toy soldier. Or if he had a photograph, he'd be able to animate that into a real person. Or if he had a magical cure that was like for a doll and it's just called magic medicine cure-all or something, he'd be able to animate that into a real magic cure that did actually cure people. So what I love about that is it has so much potential. If that had been the story, just following this character, oh my goodness, I'd have been hooked. But that wasn't really the story that we went on. It sort of started out that way, and then it all just became about finding out this list and finding out who tampered with this list. It really irritated me because I really wanted to like this book, and I feel like there was so much potential in this book, and yet I just don't feel like I ever got the payoff. I feel like it was always just leaving me with wanting more, and for about the first 60% of the book I was just confused. I was like, okay, so there's some cool stuff going on, but I don't really get why. And then about the 70% mark I was like, wow, I'm so into this, it's all starting to come together. I was like, brilliant, thank God for that. And then about the 80% mark to the end, it all got confusing again. And I was like, oh, brilliant, okay, back to square one. So this was a really mixed bag for me. It wasn't really my cup of tea, and I don't think I'll be reading the second one because I feel like it's probably going to be more of the same. I am interested in Ada Palmer as a writer because I think she has some great ideas that I could really be interested by, but I just didn't feel like they ever paid off, so I ended up only giving this like a 2.75, maybe 2.5. It wasn't a bad book, but it definitely felt muddled to me, and I know there's so many good ideas in this, but it just didn't come together. So I'm sorry, I didn't like this book as much as I wanted to either, but that is kind of my mini review of it. Let me know if you read this, what you thought. Were you on the I love it side? Were you, like me, really confused? I don't know. Let me know what you thought of it down below. The next book I have to talk about is this one. It is Empress of the Fall by David Hare. This is a proof copy, so it doesn't look quite like this on the final edition. But this one, oh, it was, again, kind of a little bit of a disappointment for me. I love David Hare as a writer. I fell in love with his series when I read the Moontide Quartet series. It's brilliantly written fantasy, definitely inspired by both Eastern and Western, set in a world that is really interesting, very, very original, and yet very familiar because it does take heavy influence from both Eastern and Western culture. It feels like you're instantly into the story. The characters in that series are fantastic. Then we get to this series, and it's not bad per se at all, it's just not as good. That's my problem with it. I felt like this was going to be the start of something really wonderful. It's the first book in the Sun Surge Quartet, which is set in the same world as the Moontide Quartet, but a couple of years later. After everything in the Moontide Quartet is ended, we follow a few of the same characters slightly, but not as major characters. But mainly we're following completely new characters. It's all just set in the same world. It largely focuses on a main character, I think her name is Lyra. She becomes the Empress in this quite early on, and she is kind of heading up this new leadership. She's trying to bring peace and order to the people, she's trying to set up a new way of life, and we follow her rule throughout quite a few different years over the course of the book, which is great, but she's really annoying at first, like super annoying. She doesn't really find her feet as a ruler for a long time, and even by the end of this book she was not my favourite character. In fact, I couldn't even say that I had a favourite character because most of the characters in this just didn't really feel genuine to me. They didn't feel like they were real, they didn't feel compelling or exciting or interesting or suspicious. I just didn't get those feelings with this book, which really, really disappointed me because in the first series I was so hooked into it, and I think the main thing was that the world was great and the characters were great, and I don't think this one did it as well. It's not bad, it's definitely not the worst fantasy book I've ever read by a long, long stretch. It is a good fantasy. I enjoyed it, but I just didn't get what I wanted from it, and that was to be an amazing start to a new series that really left me wanting to go on to the next book and the next book. This just left me a bit cold inside, and I feel like the ending was better than the start by a long way, but it just didn't get there for me quick enough. It's a long book, and it took me a long time to read it. It's about 700 pages, and it did take me about like 2 months or more to read this, I think, which never really normally happens for me, but maybe my excitement level was up here, and then when I started it and it wasn't there, it just put me right off for a bit of time. So then I had to come back to it with a fresh outlook and be like, okay, it's not going to be as good as that, but we're going to enjoy it anyway. So when I finally got to the end, I did enjoy it. I just didn't feel like it was as good, guys. I just didn't feel like it was as good. So I gave this 3 stars. It is a likeable, good read, but it's not a book that I would say this is in my top fantasy books by any means. It's just a good fantasy book. It's nothing more than that. And that's left me a little bit disappointed because I really wanted to love it and just keep raving about how much he's a great writer, but I don't know. I don't know what happened with this. Maybe I just couldn't get behind these characters and that's my main issue. I don't know, but I would love to hear if you guys have read this, what you thought of it, especially if you've read this but you've not read the Moontide Quartet. I think you might find it a lot better if you didn't already have the expectation up here that I did. So maybe that's the way to do it, is just dive into this, because you don't need to have read the previous series to read this. It's just it will spoil some of the things that happen in that series for you. I don't know. I just wish it had been better. I feel like the first two books in this review have been a little bit like, I wanted to love them, but I didn't. So 3 stars for this. Let's move on to a book I actually did enjoy, and that is The Water Knife by Paolo Bacigalupi. I've owned The Wind-Up Girl for quite a while, but I've not read it. I think it's somewhere on my shelf, although I can't see at the moment, but it's over there somewhere. I've wanted to read his books for a while, but never felt really compelled, and then I joined a real-life book club this month, which has been really good so far. I've done 1 meeting, so pushing myself out there, getting into social things again. But yeah, I joined that, and their book choice for the month was The Water Knife, which is why I read this. It's a dystopian, it's very gang heavy. It focuses on a world that has lots of economic and environmental problems. So, for example, the seawall is constantly being flooded on the coast, and in the middle of America, in the deserts, there's no water at all. It's hugely rationed. So water has become a commodity for this world. It's become something that people can sell. It's become something that is quite valuable, especially in places like Las Vegas, which are out in the deserts. And it's become a real struggle for the normal citizens of America to live and survive. And we follow a water knife, which is basically a hired assassin who goes around and does jobs for the head honcho, who is a business investor, and he is called Angel, our main character. We also have 2 other main characters. One is called Maria. She is just a sort of normal person who lives in, I believe she lives in Phoenix, I think it is, and she's kind of just trying to get by and live her life. She's got a friend who's a prostitute, and that's how she makes money, and Maria goes out and tries to sell water that she gets from the well on a slight increase in price to make a profit. So that's what she does. We also then have a character called Lucy, and Lucy is a journalist who is reporting on a lot of the bodies that are constantly being found. She is living on her own. She doesn't really have that many friends. She's got a few who are sort of journalists and photographers, but she doesn't have that many friends, and most of her family has emigrated out to Canada, where water is less of a commodity and more of a kind of given. So she's kind of abandoned on her own for the most part, and she's living trying to report on these bodies. And the 3 of these main characters do intersect at different points in the story, because we follow Angel as he comes to this town to try and find out what's been happening, why things have been going a bit down the pan for his investor, and what's really happening there. When he arrives, he finds out that things are definitely not as they first appear, and he ends up enlisting the help of Lucy, and even later down the line Maria, to try and find out what's been going on and why people have been doing sort of crazy deals and what's been happening. So it doesn't sound that great on the premise, but I do think this is what I would describe as a thriller or a dystopian thriller, because it was so fast-paced and fun. It feels like when you're reading it, it could definitely be a Hollywood film, because it's very action-packed. It's very much like unbelievable crazy stuff that is just really cool to imagine. So like jumping out of helicopters and running around with guns and shooting people, and having a den of coyotes that you release because you're a gang leader and you want to terrify people. Like, those things are actually in this book. So it is a bit mad and crazy, but equally it's definitely something that is fun to read about. It's definitely silly, it's definitely enjoyable, and it's definitely got a real punch to it. And I think the ideas about water and how valuable a commodity it could be if we came to a point where we really had to ration it is so true. It's definitely got some very interesting concepts in the book that I think the author deals with really well, even though it is a very action-packed thriller, kind of exciting spy kind of thing. It does it very well, and I liked the ideas in the background just as much as I liked the action and the kind of compelling pace of it all. So I actually gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. It's definitely a solid read for me, and I do want to pick up more of his books now. So I'm happy that I read that, and it was a book that I probably wouldn't have got around to for ages had I not joined this book group. So I'm very glad I have, and I'm looking forward to next month's book, whatever that is, because I think the theme is space. So I'm excited to see what they end up picking. So those are the 3 books I had to review for you in this video. Do let me know in the comments what you guys thought of them, if you've read either these authors or these particular books by them. I'd love to have your thoughts. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon in my next video. Bye guys!
Thank you for watching my video today. Go pick up a book, then come back and chat with me again.